On behalf of President George Weah, President of the Republic of Liberia, and the government people of Liberia, I extend warmest greetings to all of you. And big thank you for first choosing Liberia to host this great event. The Liberian people are a warm, affectionate, and hospitable people. I think you've already felt their hospitality. Wish you a long stay and enjoyable stay here in our great country. Mr. Director for the West Africa Office of the ECA and Mr. UNDP Res Rep and representing the UN Rep, thank you for your remarks. My brief comments, scattered as they are, will reflect some of the themes you've already addressed. It's critical when we meet at these fora and focus on the key themes of the development plans that countries develop, the Sustainable Development Goals, which have now replaced the Millennium Goals of the UN, Africa Agenda 2063, which is under the auspices of the African Union. All of these goals are quite critical. What these goals intend to convey is that unless Africa achieves growth on a sustainable basis, everything we talk here, much of what we do is for naught. And so sustainability is the critical element. Sustainability of private sector investment so that growth can be more stable and not subject to the kinds of fluctuations that we have seen across the continent since the end of the Second World War. And I make this point because all of African economies are really dependent on commodity exports, including my country. So the growth we've seen in the country is because of higher commodity prices. And we do know 200 years of economic history tell that commodity prices are bound to fall. They will recover, but they will inevitably fall. The challenge then is that countries that face high prices, whether in terms of oil, iron ore, gold, what do they do with the surplus when prices are high? We've seen the situation where countries have enjoyed high price, but they do not prepare for the time when the prices will be low. And so hence what we call the shock. And then we get the budget support from our development partners. This is the cycle. I'm arguing that we need to break that cycle. We need to end Africa's dependence on commodity prices by transitioning African economies to local manufacturing, agriculture development, value addition, which will inaugurate an era of what I call hard growth. So when growth is hard, then it's not easily subject to volatility. The growth that we've heard around this table about is still soft because it's still looking for a recovery in global oil prices. From Nigeria, who's exporting oil. We're all looking for a recovery in rubber prices. The rubber planters come to me, Minister, we see some hope coming, the prices are rising. Yeah, so better times are coming. That, we know. When we do that, we know the price will still fall. And so, I really appreciate this theme of sustainability coming out of this, and I want the deliberations to focus on that. Liberia's current macro situation is largely on account of this commodity stock, because the price of iron ore has dropped to such an extent that today government revenue is seriously affected. Rubber planters no longer have the revenue they once had 6 years ago, and you can imagine the ramifications across the economy of this shock. Population growth, which has also been shared, is a critical theme that we need to spend a lot of time on. All evidence shows that Africa will be the only continent that will have the highest proportion of young people in the working age. And so economists and demographers and statisticians say this is called a demographic dividend. For a country to have a huge population that is able to work and to produce goods and services, that means that country is able to go on a higher growth trajectory. So the demographic dividend is a good thing, but that has to be leveraged. Unfortunately, if Africa is not able to provide jobs for that massive, humongous population, you know the consequence already. There will be a relapse back into the conflict and crisis that we saw for much of the years in the 1990s. There will be social tension. There will be violence. And so where we see opportunities for a demographic transition to actualize the dividend, we should also be thinking that the reverse side of that is a national security risk across African countries. So we need to do something about that. So that means that while people are having children, while the population is growing, in tandem with that should be strong policies and programs on private sector-led growth, particularly in areas like agriculture, which will then absorb a large fraction of those people in the labor market. For this to happen, a lot of work has to be done, including the work that you're doing here today, including the discussions and the policy debates that are going to happen and the recommendations that come from there. A lot of work. I will emphasize a few things. Infrastructure has to change. There is no real private sector transformation outside of infrastructure, and by infrastructure I mean electricity infrastructure, road infrastructure, and of course mobile telephony infrastructure, water infrastructure. I can tell you this, Spain, which is now probably the richest country in Europe, has more electricity per capita than all of Africa. This is unacceptable. Spain, it is not Germany, it is not the UK, it's not the highest on the totem pole in terms of development, has more electricity per capita than more than 1 billion people who live in Africa. This story has to change, because the persistence of that narrative means, of course, then that Africa cannot catch up with Asia, with Latin America, so we already know that. Road infrastructure, the deficit is huge. Where Africa has been able to close the infrastructure gap, I think in the last 25 years, is in mobile telephony. And so this is where Africa has the opportunity to leapfrog some of the physical infrastructure constraints. But for that to happen, we need to see a real focus on relaxing infrastructure constraints, which are critical for private investment, addressing investment climate issues, business climate issues, getting more PPPs, for example. The share of PPPs coming to Africa pales in comparison to any other continent, so it's not even worth talking about. Only 5 countries, I think 4 or 5 countries, have received huge 50% of all private sector flows coming for infrastructure. This would be South Africa, maybe Nigeria, Uganda, Kenya, that's it. Everybody else gets a very tiny share. I think we have APM terminal in Liberia here, the Freeport of Monrovia concession out on a PPP basis. For countries to attract private flows, we need to do a lot of work, and development partners and governments need to work to improve the business climate, to address concerns that investors have about bringing their money in Africa. This is where the conversation has to happen. Public sector resources are quite inadequate to transform the infrastructure gap in Africa. And so we need to pay attention to that. Higher quality human capital development is a theme. This was stressed by my brother and friend Palami. The quality of education has to change. Earlier, before coming here, we're just having a conversation with the technicians around the room. I said, look, what kind of education are we giving our children? We should be giving them more mathematics, more science, and more technology education. We have children across Africa sitting, memorizing boring subjects that will not matter for them in their livelihood or in their job search for 12 years. This is a waste of intellectual capacity. That has to change. Okay, that has to change. Students should go in on Monday and do mathematics twice a day. Tuesday, do mathematics twice a day. The same thing for science-related subjects, for language subjects that enhance their thinking. They need to spend more time doing that. But how do we do that? We need to change curricula. We can't be operating in this 21st century technology economy and drawing on 1960 curricula for our schools. That has to change. This is what we mean by investment in human capital. The quality of teachers, the quality of teachers, the quality of what teachers are teaching, has to change. So I make this case because a lot of the money we get in official development assistance goes to the social sector. I love the social sector. When people are getting the required education, that's good for the private sector. What we find is that more than twice, so if social sector, if economic infrastructure has received about 20% over the last 50 years, the social sector has gotten 40%, twice that. So, but what is the return on that investment? That's the question we're asking. Even though we're spending more money on health and education, even though we invest more money there, what is the commensurate return we see such that we have better teachers, we have students who are able to read at grade level. I mean, we have students who are strong mathematically, who can then go and develop the engineering profiles, the technological jobs that matter for the population transition that we see. Unless we do this policy shift, we're not going to see human capital transformation. We can't. And so I would expect a strong recommendation coming from these deliberations for the ministries of education, beginning with my own ministry, that we expect to see something changing, okay, in terms of how many hours students stay in school and the composition of the study of that stay. I'll be looking forward to that recommendation. Another big movement has to be in agriculture. I call it, we need to move to big agriculture. We've been doing small agriculture in Africa. Subsistence, little here and there. If we have to employ the population that's coming, we need to change the face of agriculture. That means we need to de-risk lending to the sector. Banks do not want to lend to the sector because they say the sector is risky, they will not recover their money. That's a tragedy. Since we know one thing is constant, every day people have to eat. There's no way life can continue if people do not eat. And the only thing people eat is grown. And so the return in agriculture should be high. We should work to structure the sector such that it is profitable, because bankers should earn money on the money they lend. Let development partners, let governments and ministers of finance, let stakeholders work together with ECOWAS, UNCA to ensure, let's de-risk lending so that you don't give a farmer 1 year loan and say start paying in 3 months. I mean, it's counterintuitive. The guy has to clear the land plan, and the thing has to grow. So we need loans to farmers to say, look, you have a 2-year moratorium. So governments like Liberia and Sierra Leone and Nigeria get loans from the World Bank, and they're giving a 5-year moratorium at the national level, right? We don't pay principal for 5 years. Sadly, we don't do the same thing for a local farmer. We do that for a government like Liberia, Nigeria, but we don't do that for a farmer like Flomo from Vahun, who brings his farm and says, I want loan, and we tell him, well, you got only 6 months, start paying back. We need to change the structure of the way we lend to the sector. We need to change the structure of our value addition mechanism. Okay? So these are the big movers that have to happen. Attracting private sector flow, addressing infrastructure, paying attention more to agriculture. The other big elephant in the room is regional integration. Regional integration. Evidence now shows that countries that are regionally integrated, for example, will have lower prices, we have more competition, we have higher standard of living, and those that have common currency area will have the lowest inflation. We see that in the CFA area. The inflation rate in these countries are probably 1.2%, 2%. They have a common currency. West Africa has been talking about a common currency for some time now. I would say, let this deliberation challenge West African presidents, governments, to move toward a common currency in the next 2 to 3 years. Let them accelerate the conversation on integration. I think sometimes the conversation is just quotidian. It's happening every time, year in year. We can have conversation on integration in common currency area for the next decade, the decade after that. This is a mirage. We need to change the narrative since we already know the economic benefits. Okay? We already know that. So let's integrate our economies more, and I would like to see that team highlighted here in your deliberations. And in that sense, speaking of integration, I would say, Madam Commissioner, you have the strongest support of this government to ensure that we support the Commission. Because if we don't support our Commission, we also are not supporting integration. So for example, the President has ordered that going forward, ECOWA levy is ECOWA levy, and it's not for government. It's not for the government of Liberia. So you're going to have your levy. We have structured all of our area packages to you, and please tell the president that the president is strong. You know he comes from ECOWAS though. He's a big fan of ECOWAS, so he doesn't want under him for us to owe anything. We know the challenges countries face, but we're dedicated to supporting the Commission so that you can achieve your broader integration goals. So my recommendation to this forum, to conclude, will be that let this deliberation, let the recommendations, let the expertise that will come across from the table here in all the different sessions not be packaged into some dossier or some book that goes and sit down on a desk and then wait for the next deliberation. Those recommendations should make their way to Parliament. They should make their way in national budgets. So I'm calling for a broader advocacy for your recommendations from these bodies across Africa, AU, ECOWAS, to find meaningful impact in policy discourse within governments, in program implementation among multilateral and bilateral partners. You have to sustain that advocacy and not bring us here every time to talk, but we can't do the do that we're talking about. So I trust that this deliberation will begin to change that. Let's implement the recommendations that you sent to us during our national budget discussions, during our policy framing. So I call for stronger advocacy. I'm saying let us make the SDG succeed. Let us make Africa Agenda 2063 a success. You just heard the statistics from Panama that despite all the investments, the Millennium Development Goal, many African countries were not able to meet the Millennium Development Goal. We need to reflect on why that happened, because the same fate will befall the Sustainable Development Goals as well. So these things, SDGs, Africa 2030, PAPD, should not be mantras that are rehashable every 5 years or 10 years. They should matter for the livelihood, sustainability of our people across the continent. So let's translate them into action and support them. You have the support of this government. The SDGs, the PAPD, has goals that have incorporated SDGs, including Africa 2063. We are developing a framework. As a matter of fact, there's a cabinet today that the government is discussing at a steering committee level how we actualize, how we work with our partner to meet these goals. Together as Africa, as Julie Andy said, Africa will shine again. Africa will rise. Africa will rise. And that rise will happen because men and women around the table are committed to Africa, governments around the table are committed to Africa, and we will ensure that we put the destiny of our transformation in our own hands. Thank you very much.